When we look at the Gospel of John, what we notice is that it actually documents a lot of miraculous things that Jesus did. And it's often described as the signs and wonders book because from the beginning we find in chapter 2, Jesus goes to the wedding at Cana and they run out of wine. So first miracle is Jesus turning water into wine. And then immediately following that, there's healing of royal official's son. There's healing of paralytic man, feeding of 5,000, and walking on water. And then giving sight to a man born blind. And then we come to raising of dead Lazarus. Now, perhaps in the Gospel of John and in the ministry of Jesus himself, the climax, the pinnacle of Jesus' ministry is summed up right here in chapter 11. So when we look at Lazarus and the fact that he had died and that Jesus raises him back to life, this is the one that truly shows Jesus to be the Messiah. Because Lazarus here, being dead, and the only one who can raise a dead person back to life would be the Messiah. So as a result of this raising of Lazarus, what we find that afterwards, Jesus is no longer free to walk around. In fact, there are people now that have risen that are upset at Jesus because they don't think he's the Messiah. And that people following are growing because they see Lazarus, who is dead, and they see Jesus, who has brought him back to life, and people are believing. So now there's a threat that they want to kill both Lazarus and Jesus. So just a little bit of background and then we'll get into details. So here's this man named Lazarus, and the name Lazarus means God is my help. And we need to note that this Lazarus is not the same Lazarus that's mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, verse 19 to 31, where there's a beggar who dies and goes to Abram's bosom. So it's not the same Lazarus, but this Lazarus is the one who lives in Bethany of Judea, which is about 2 miles from Jerusalem. And remember, Jesus was ministering in Jerusalem, and that's why geography plays an important role, because if he's only 2 miles away, why didn't Jesus rush over as soon as he heard that Lazarus was sick? So here we find in this town of Bethany of Judea, brothers of sisters, Mary and Martha was sick. And Mary is the one, she is the famous one who actually, we find in John chapter 12, very next chapter, that she is the one who anoints Jesus with very expensive fragrance, pours it on his feet, washes the feet of Jesus with her hair. So Mary and Martha, they send message in verse 3 to Jesus saying, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now, upon receiving this message, this is Jesus' response in John chapter 11, verse 4. This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus knew in advance. Remember, he is divine, so he can see all things in advance and knows all things. So he knows that Lazarus would actually die, but that he would come back, that Jesus would raise him back to life. And that through this, it would bring glory to God, and people would know that Son of God, Jesus, is the Messiah. So here, Jesus says in verse 6, so upon hearing the loved one being sick, you would think that he would rush over right away since he's only 2 miles away. But instead, in verse 6, he says, it says that he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now, this was calculated intentional delay. And the reason for this is this. When the news was sent that Lazarus had died, the messenger would have to travel from Bethany to where Jesus was, and probably took him a day to find. And then Jesus, it would take him, that day to go back. But we find that in verse 39, that when Jesus had returned to Bethany to see Lazarus, that he had been dead for 4 days. So when you calculate it, it means that as soon as a messenger was dispatched, Lazarus had already died. So in fact, if Jesus went back, Lazarus would have been dead already 2 days. So why the delay? Then it makes sense, because here, as much as Jesus loved Mary and Martha, the death of Lazarus had godly purpose. Remember, Jesus himself says it is for the glory of God, that God's Son may be glorified. So when we look upon why 4 days, there's a belief in the Jewish people, in the Middle Eastern culture, that when a person dies, and even in Hollywood movies they make this, that for the 3 days the soul lingers around the body. And that for 3 days the soul, because it's near the body, can come back to life. So when Jesus arrives and it's been 4 days, there is absolute certainty that Lazarus is dead, that the soul is also not around, and that he is truly, genuinely dead, that can't come back to life on his own. So this is why being 4 days, meaning absolute death, there's no way possibility that he would come back to life on his own. And this is why Jesus, going on the 4th day, is important. So Jesus clarifies in verse 14, because the disciples are kind of confused. Well, why is this all going to be for glorifying God? So Jesus says, Lazarus is dead. I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. Nevertheless, let's go to him. This is verse 14 to 15. And we're kind of surprised that Jesus says we're glad. He's not saying that they're glad. Jesus is glad that Lazarus is finally dead, but he is saying that he is glad because the death of Lazarus will help the disciples to believe. And he calls the disciples to go to Lazarus. He doesn't say, let's go to Bethany. He says, let's go to Lazarus, because this is personal. They're not just going for, sake of going to a location, but they're talking about their friend Lazarus. So verse 17 says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Remember? 4 days. And Jesus, where he was in Jerusalem, was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. He could have easily made the trip quickly, but he didn't. And the whole purpose was to glorify God, and that everyone will know that, remember, this is about signs that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. So when at this point, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he first would appear on the outer side of the town. And at this point, the many Jews, people that were close to Mary and Martha and Lazarus, had come, and they're comforting the loss of their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out. She went out of her house to meet Jesus. And Mary stayed home. Now, because of the culture that when you have a lost person, someone who has died, a family member must remain at the house so that they can receive guests who come to weep. So Mary remained behind. Martha goes out to see Jesus, and she meets Jesus. And the first word she says to Jesus in verse 21 is, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. What basically Martha is saying is that she is expressing her sorrow, saying, if you had been here, perhaps, you could have prevented Lazarus from dying. But she's not upset at Jesus, because notice what she says in verse 22. She has this faith, and she makes a statement. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So she has this hope, and she's saying, I know that you are special, and that if you ask God, God will answer your prayer. So she's kind of going nudge, nudge, can you do something about Lazarus? And Jesus then responds, your brother will rise again. Now, Jesus is talking present tense. It's going to happen now. But Martha takes this as, even though she sounded like she's a person of faith, she really doesn't believe what Jesus says. And Jesus says, well, if you're talking about, verse 24, she responds and says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So Martha sounds like she has faith, but then she says, no. I know when Jesus says your brother will rise again, Martha goes, sure, yeah. At the end of times when there's resurrection, sure, he'll rise back to life. And then Jesus drills in, and this is probably perhaps the most powerful statement that Jesus makes, and it's the last of the I am sayings. Now, the I am sayings in the Gospel of John is a declaration of Jesus' identity. I am. Remember when Moses asked God, Yahweh, and said, who shall I say you are? What is your name so that I can go to the people and say that God sent me and his name is, because up to this point Moses didn't know the name. So God says, I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. So in the Gospel of John, when Jesus declares himself as I am, he says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of this world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the living bread. And he continues on and he says today in verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. He's declaring that I am Yahweh, God, the Messiah, the promised one, and this is my identity. And I am the resurrection and the life. And this is the crux, the essence of the Gospel of John, when Jesus declares that I am the resurrection and the life. Because what is truly the greatest enemy that we see in this world is death. COVID-19 is killing tons of people all over the world. Why? It's the result of sin. And the power and the stronghold of sin is death. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. I will defeat death. Amen. So Jesus goes on and he's explaining to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. And everyone hearing this, they're going, well, what does that mean? And when Jesus says, your brother will rise again, and he coincides that with, I am the resurrection and the life. If people had faith, they would see the connection and actually anticipate what is about to happen. But nobody anticipates this because it's been 4 days. 4 days that Lazarus has been in the tomb, and he is dead, that there's no way he would come back. And Jesus earlier, prior to this, in John chapter 5, verse 25, said this, most certainly I tell you, the hour comes and now is when the dead will hear the Son of God's voice, and those who hear will live. This is John chapter 5, verse 25. So before this, several weeks before this actual event, Jesus tells people, there will be a time soon when the dead will hear the Son of God, his voice, Jesus' voice, and those who hear will live. And Jesus is connecting, and he's trying to say all of these things that he has said before to the fact that I am the resurrection and the life. Your brother will rise again. Martha doesn't clue in, so anyway, she runs back home, tells Mary. Verse 28, the teacher is here and asking for you. So Martha tells Mary, and upon hearing this, Mary then, now that Martha's home, Mary can go out. So Mary goes out quickly and went to Jesus at the place where Jesus met Martha. And then verse 32 says this, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Same thing that Martha said. But the key point I want you to focus on is the fact that she fell at his feet. And the word she fell is actually like she dropped. She basically got tired and just dropped on the feet of Jesus. Now I want you to visualize this, because Jesus comes, and Mary, for the last couple of days, 4 days, had been weeping and mourning, and it's tiring. And she probably didn't get much sleep, and she's very exhausted. And when she comes to Jesus, she's rushing over to Jesus, and then she basically just drops. You know, normally when you read the phrase like falling at the feet of Jesus, the word that's used would be in worship, but the word that's used here in Greek is not. It's actually tripped and dropped. So I see Mary as being in a state of exhaustion, and she's saying, I'm so glad you're here. I'm exhausted, and she falls at the feet of Jesus, and then she kind of lets out her heart's grief. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then Jesus sees her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping. And the word uses kleio. And here, the reason why this word is important is that when Jesus weeps, it's a different word. We'll go into it a little more. But here, Jesus sees people weeping. Mary, Martha weeping, and all the others that come together weep. Now, the word that's used here is actually wailing. So, kleio, the word that's described here, is very hysterical weeping, crying, just losing it, basically. In the Middle Eastern culture, what they used to do is at funeral, when someone has died, because it's really tiring to cry hard for a long time, they hired people to be professional criers. So these people, these Jews, some of the people that have come along, are probably hired weepers. So they're there, and they take turns, because it goes through several days of wailing. It's not easy, so they are wailing away. But Jesus sees Mary and Martha, and Jesus sees the genuine grief, the hurt. And then verse 33 says, he was deeply moved and groaned, like deeply moved. A lot of Bible translation miss the word that's used here is enebrimasato. And this word is actually describing a horse snorting. Okay, I don't know. Best way to describe that would be like, you ever see horses before they attack? They go like, make that noise, and their nose would flare. So this is the emotion that Jesus was feeling. In other words, he sees everyone crying, and he is actually very angry inside. He's like he's brewing with anger. And then the other word is described as he, troubled, ataraxen, and it's a deep disturbance that moves him. So why is Jesus so angry at seeing everyone weeping? Is because he is seeing the result, the effect of sin. He is seeing that the result of sin is death, and when he sees death, and when he sees people crying over it, he's seeing the kingdom of Satan being enlarged. And he's angry because he knows that soon, after this event, a couple of months down the road, he's going to the cross. And he's going to defeat the last enemy, which is death. But it hasn't been defeated yet. So he sees the power of Satan at work, death that's causing people to cry, and he is just deeply angered inside him. So this anger is actually at Satan, at sin, because the effect of sin is all this death, and death is not what God created to be. That death was not brought in until Satan entered and disobedience and sin entered. So Jesus is deeply troubled, And then look what it says in verse 35, Jesus wept. Remember when Mary, Martha, and the Jewish people were weeping, the word uses kleio. And then here, when Jesus wept, it's adakrusen, from the word dakru, which means quietly and softly weeping. So Jesus doesn't lose it. He doesn't go wailing like Mary and Martha. Why? Because Jesus also knows that shortly Lazarus is going to come back to life. He's going to raise him back to life. So he's not weeping at the death, but he is still weeping because he's seeing the impact of sin, what Satan is doing, and he is upset over it, and he is empathizing. He's actually compassionate. He sees Mary and Martha, and he's like, oh, my dear friends are impacted by Satan and sin. So his weeping is more of compassionate crying. And this is such a beautiful imagery because Jesus is understanding. And you know, sometimes we wonder when we go through a loss of a loved one, and many of us have experienced, whether it's your parent or parents or grandparents or even your sibling, that when you lose a loved one, the pain is so great. But here, Jesus, seeing Mary and Martha's pain, seeing the pain that Satan has caused, he's also compassionate and empathizing, and he sheds tears. And then verse 38 says, Jesus once more deeply groaned. Okay, we didn't read it, but it says, Jesus once more deeply moved. And that word moved or groaned is the same word used in verse 33. Embrimaomai. And it's the one where, you know, like snorting like the horse. It's like angered inside. And he is deeply angered when he comes to the tomb. And he knows that Lazarus is inside that tomb. So Jesus then comes to the tomb. And in verse 39 he says, take away the stone. To take away the stone is like, in a modern version, it's like telling the family members at the gravesite to say, take a shovel and dig up here. Let's bring the body up. It would actually bring great shock and pain and disturbance to the grieving family. So when Jesus says, move to take away the stone, Martha interjects. He says, but Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Think about that. Palestine is very, hot. It's hot, humid. So body would decompose very rapidly. In fact, body would decompose probably, almost the next day. From second day onward. By fourth day would be very stinky, dead. So Martha objects. And family member actually has to consent before, you can open up the tomb. So Jesus then says to Mary and Martha, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So now they're on the spot. And Mary and Martha consent. So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and he's praying now. He says in verse 41, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. So Jesus makes this prayer, and notice that in the prayer, Jesus doesn't say, God, help me to bring Lazarus back to life. That's not his prayer. His prayer is to thank God, saying that you've always heard me. So this prayer is actually to those who have gathered in the tomb site. Jesus is not praying for him to have power to raise Lazarus back to life, but he is just saying a prayer so that everyone around can hear that what he is about to do, it is because God is with him, and he is God. I am in him, and he is in me. So he is declaring this and just confirming to everyone, let them know that that's what it is. So he makes his prayer so that people around him can hear. So here's what happens afterwards. Verse 43, when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Now, Jesus mentions Lazarus because remember, he's by the tomb. So he's in the cemetery kind of like. So if Jesus didn't mention the name Lazarus and said, come out, people were saying Jesus mentioned Lazarus because if he didn't, all the other dead people would have come out. So Jesus, they're saying, naturally had to identify, specify that it's only Lazarus that he's calling out. And then verse 44. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. This is truly a scary scene if you think about this. 4 days, he's been in the tomb, didn't eat, didn't drink, hasn't moved, so his muscles and everything would have been stiff. And the fact that dead man comes out walking just like out of one of those zombie movies. Here is Lazarus. And he comes out in his burial cloth. And Jesus says basically, take off the grave clothes and let him go. This is truly miraculous because this action proves that Jesus is the Messiah, that the dead man who has been buried for 4 days is brought back to life. Now, Lazarus later on dies, right, eventually. So this is not the true resurrection. Some people say that Lazarus was the first one who was resurrected. True resurrection is when you, from death, you're brought back to life and you don't die again. Okay, that's what happens. That's what happened to Jesus. He was brought back, remember, to life, and then he rose and ascended into heaven, never to see death again. And on the second coming of Jesus, you and I will also be resurrected to eternal life. That's true resurrection. So Lazarus here later on dies of natural causes. So he is not truly resurrected. So let's look at some of the lessons from here. One thing that we need to see is this. Jesus comes to us. Jesus goes to Mary and Martha to Bethany. Jesus knows that there's sickness, there's death, there's grieving, there's hurting, and Jesus goes to where Mary and Martha are. And when I look at this, I see the wonderful kindness of Jesus in that when you and I go through difficult situations, when you and I go through mourning and grieving and painful situations, Jesus comes to us. He comes to us. He's not a God who says, you know what? I don't care what you're going through. I'm way over here in Jerusalem. You guys all come to me. But instead here, Jesus goes to Bethany. And then what do we need to do? When we find that he is coming near to us, we need to also go. What Mary and Martha did. Especially Mary. Go to Jesus and just fall at his feet. And I love that imagery because, there are times when you and I go through difficult situations, it's overbearing, and you don't know what to do. You feel like you're going to basically crash and burn. Jesus here, the imagery that's shown is that Mary comes and just falls at his feet. And she's saying, oh, only if you were here earlier. Whatever that's on your heart, whatever that's bogging you down, whatever that's troubling you, go to Jesus, fall at his feet, and just cry out. And that's prayer. Coming into the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ in prayer, just dropping everything at the feet of Jesus, saying, here's my burdens, here's my worries, here's my troubles, here's my pain. I give it all to you. Remember 1 Peter 5:7 says, cast all your anxieties on Jesus because he cares for you. And that's what we see here. And the second thing we see is that Jesus sees our tears. Verse 33 says, Jesus saw her weeping. Think of how painful it is. When you lose a loved one, when you go through a really hard time. Crying. Bible here shows that even, not just Mary, Martha crying, but Jesus weeping, shows that crying is not a sin. That as a Christian, if you lose a loved one at a funeral, it's okay to cry. Because some people say, you know what, if you believe in Jesus and the resurrection, you shouldn't cry. Well, tell that to Jesus. Because if Jesus weeps and Jesus sees our tears, we can certainly cry, because crying is an expression of love. You can only cry when a loved one dies. If someone you hate dies, you're not going to shed tears. In fact, tears won't come out. You'll be going like, he deserved it. But Jesus sees our tears, that when we're going through hard times, you can drop at the feet of Jesus and cry. And what this shows is that Jesus sees our tears and he understands. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 3 says about the Messiah, a man of sorrows and familiar with sufferings. In other words, Jesus has gone through sorrows and sufferings, and he knows, when he sees tears, he knows why. And Hebrews chapter 4 verse 15 says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet without sin. Jesus sees our tears. He knows the impact of sin. He knows when you and I are hurting. And he is saying, I see your tears, and Jesus also weeps with us. Bible mentions 3 times when Jesus actually shed tears. One is here. The other time is when Jesus, on his way to Jerusalem, he sees Jerusalem and he sheds tears because that's where he's going to die, and that's where people are still going to reject him. So he sheds tears for the hearts that are hardened and hearts that are not repentant. And then the third time he weeps is at Gethsemane, when he is praying as he looks forward to the cross. He's actually praying about preparing for the cross, and he sheds tears. But here, when Jesus weeps, it shows that Jesus is compassionate, he's loving, he's kind, and that he comes and he sees Mary, Martha, and everyone crying, and he shares in that. When you and I come to Jesus and we fall at the feet of Jesus and we lay everything down, and when you're flustered and you're crying out to Jesus, Jesus also sheds tears with you. He is compassionate, he is loving, he is kind. And that Jesus came to fix what was broken by sin, and that's what happens when Jesus goes to the cross. When he dies, when he's resurrected, we find that he brings victory over sinful situations. That when Lazarus is brought back to life, it means that where there is death, where there is no hope, Jesus can change all of that. And this is what's lovely, what's wonderful, is that by raising Lazarus back to life, Jesus shows us that he delivers us from grief to joy and from death to life. And in Jesus we have the living hope, because he is the resurrection and the life. This is the good news for us today. Thanks be to God. Amen. Let's bow our heads.